All right, students. The fourth section of chapter 18 talks about how things progressed in the later years of the war and how things came sort of to almost to a close. On this slide, we'll talk a little bit about this guy, General Burnside. You can't see him; his picture's cut off over here. I'm really sorry about that, but we talked about him in class. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were able to defeat people with groups of men twice their size because they knew the land, because they were just such outstanding generals. And Lee defeated Burnside literally by luring him into a trap at Fredericksburg. Hang on just a second. 1 second. Sorry, y'all. I'm having like a coughing fit. Allergies are bad today. Anyway, so Lee literally lured Burnside into this trap at Fredericksburg. He knew that Burnside was going to try to chase him down, because that's what they were all trying to do, and they were all going to try to capture Richmond and invade Richmond. And so where the city of Fredericksburg is, there's hills, and Lee's men dug themselves into trenches on the sides of these hills and just waited for Burnside's guys to come walking, marching down the road, and they literally simply fired down on them like fish in a barrel. And when Burnside's guys tried to fire up to them on the hill, they couldn't do anything with it because, the guys were in the trenches and the dirt was in front of them. So Burnside suffered horrible, horrible losses at Fredericksburg, and he goes back to Washington, D.C., and he resigns. Lincoln doesn't even have to fire him. He resigns. He's in such disgrace. All right, so let's talk about Chancellorsville. This is the next huge, giant Union defeat for one of Lincoln's wonderful generals. He then turns the army over to a guy named Hooker, who decides to take Lee on at Chancellorsville, Virginia. And Hooker had twice as many men as Lee, but Lee still has Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, and Lee says, here's what we're going to do, Jackson. We're going to divide ourselves up, and you are going to sneak around the side of Hooker's forces, sneak around the back of him. That's called flanking. And we will trap him so that I'm firing at him in the front. I will draw his fire. Look at me, I'm in front of you. Keep your attention here, and you go around the side of him and around the back of him, and we will trap him, which is exactly what happened. And so Hooker was completely disabled, and again, an utter defeat. The bad thing here is that Chancellorsville, this is where Stonewall Jackson was injured by friendly fire. This is where Lee loses Jackson, and it's a terrible loss, because Jackson and Lee together were a fantastic team, just like Grant and Sherman were. And it's a loss for Lee, and it's demoralizing for the South as well, because they know that Stonewall Jackson is a huge asset to them. But Hooker, again, like Burnside, goes back to Washington, D.C., completely defeated and demoralized, as well he should be, and Lincoln is going to have to fire him as well. Okay, so there are obviously problems with Union leadership. McClellan had been overly cautious at Antietam. Lincoln fires him when he refused to chase Lee down. Lincoln was not a war veteran, so he does not have experience fighting a war, but he knows enough to know that if you've got your lead general on the run, you chase him down and finish him off. He knows enough to know that much. So he fired McClellan. Next, Lincoln had handed the army over to Burnside, who was caught like a rat in a trap by Lee. So Lincoln dismissed him, gives the army over to Hooker, who gets outsmarted by Lee at Chancellorsville, and Lincoln gets rid of him, and that's 3 generals down, 3 generals out, and Lincoln is like, okay, who am I going to give this army to that can actually lead it and be able to get some wins? Now, I will say one thing about McClellan. While he was not effective on a battlefield, he did do a lot to train the army up while he was training them in Washington, D.C. So I will give him that much. He just was incompetent as a commander on a battlefield. All right, let's talk about African Americans in the Civil War. Obviously, they're not allowed to fight for the South at all, because if you put a rifle or a gun in the hand of an African American in the South, they're going to turn it on the Southerners, as well they should. And at first, Lincoln won't allow them to serve in the North either because of the border states. He's afraid he's going to upset the border state governments because they've still allowed slavery. He's also afraid he's going to upset some of the men who serve in some of the units of that are from border states, okay? Because some of those men, believe in slavery and they don't want African Americans to be with them. But by the end of the war, about 10% of Union forces were African Americans, because even by the end of 1862, the North simply needs more men. It's that easy. I mean, and so they have African Americans enlist after that. I want to talk a little bit about the 54th Massachusetts. It is an infantry division, and I don't know that this is going to be heavily tested, but this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because these men were so respected. And if you look up anything about them, it just, to me, they're so admirable. Almost all, no, not almost, all of the commanders of African American units were white. This has less to do with discrimination than practicality. None of the African Americans who enlisted had had any experience fighting, which was not their fault. They had not been allowed to join the military. And none of them had been able to go to West Point because that simply wasn't allowed either. So obviously there was discrimination. I'm not trying to make light of that. But the reason, I think really, the main reason all of these units had white people in charge is because there weren't any African Americans who had any experience here. Later on, African Americans will be put in charge. Okay, not right away, obviously, and there is racism, but this is also a practical reason too. But this 54th Massachusetts unit was an amazing bunch of people. They had an assault on Fort Wagner, which they lost, but they fought very bravely. And the Fort Wagner battle is the one you need to know, because this is the battle that William Carney is involved with, and he is the one who is the first African American that is awarded the Medal of Honor. And he might likely be tested, but more important than that, he's just an amazing individual, and you should be familiar with his name. Now, the soldiers in these units did not receive equal pay, but more than that, the book doesn't tell you this. Some of the soldiers in these units, not the 54th, but some other ones, refused to take pay. They just said, please just give us uniforms and guns and supplies. Feed us, give us clothing and bullets and guns, and let us head south. That's good enough. And you can understand the feeling. You can understand why, which is what makes this cause near and dear to my heart. The thing is that even though they didn't have equal pay, and even though a lot of these units did not get the best of the guns or the best of the uniforms, they proved that they could do the job as well or better than any of the white soldiers. And why is that? Well, that's because this was an important cause for them. They were fighting for the freedom of people like them. They saw there was no reason for slavery, and they wanted to end it, and it was important to them. A lot of these people later on stayed in the service because they felt like this was a calling for them, and they became part of the units that became the Buffalo Soldiers, which again, it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which we talk more about when we teach Texas history, which I taught for many a year. Okay, let's talk about Gettysburg. Hold on, I'm going to stop this right here so I can get this lined up better. Okay, better. So Gettysburg is known as the turning point of the Civil War. That will be tested. You need to know it. This happens in the spring of 1863. And until then, in the spring of 1863, so for a good couple years, the Confederates are still winning most of the battles. In July of 1863, Robert E. Lee tried one more time to invade the North, and you can see the map. Gettysburg is just across the state line from Maryland into Pennsylvania. Now, again, Maryland is a border state. It stayed with the North. But Virginia, hang on, is right here. Maryland here, Pennsylvania here. So it's close in distance. He's doing this to try to impress Britain, to hope that they will come in on their side. The battle at Gettysburg happens, not that Lee isn't anticipating a battle, because he is, but remember, Lee is a tactician and a strategist. And the battle opens up before he's really honestly quite ready. Not because of espionage this time, but because of an accident, sort of, okay? It happened like this. Whoops, my back up. It happened because Meade, who is opposite of McClellan, not McClellan, he's going to chase Lee down. Meade has people in Gettysburg and in that area, but Lee doesn't know that. Gettysburg had some warehouses full of supplies, and so some of Lee's guys, Lee's men that were camped outside Gettysburg, decided on their own without being told to go into Gettysburg to get some supplies, sneak in there and get some supplies. In the meantime, the Northern troops that were there saw the Southerners, and they're like, what are Southerners doing here in Gettysburg? Oh my gosh, what are you doing here? You're rebels. How did you get here in Pennsylvania? And the fighting breaks out. And it's before Lee is really set up and ready to do this. So the fighting was brutal. It lasts for 4 days. And Lee is defeated, and Meade chases him back down into Virginia, chasing. And it ends Lee's any hope of invading the North. It's a bitter defeat for the Confederates, and it will end up being a huge commemorative battlefield graveyard. All right, and Vicksburg also, now you will see that, in fact, I think I'm going to stop here. We're going to talk about Vicksburg by itself later on.